welcome to this edition of Monitor Forum. Today we're going to look at the Soviet Union and turn to Henry David Thoreau, Thoreau of Walden Pond. Today there's a controversy surrounding Walden Pond. Plans are for large-scale office development, but that's not the focus of our time with Thoreau. Instead, with the help of Thomas Blanding, president of the Thoreau Society and of the Thoreau Country Conservation Alliance, we're going to look back at Thoreau and talk about the importance and relevancy to us today of the values he espoused. Thomas Blanding will be joining us in a short while. But first, we're going to take a look at the Soviet Union. Such is the pace of change, so many are the rumors, that we're going to do our best to cut through those and look at some of the root issues of the struggle for reform within the Soviet Union itself. Where, for instance, does Mother Russia, as compared with the Soviet Union, fare in all of the reforms? My first guest is Dmitri Shalin, who is a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Russian Research Center and is an associate professor in the Sociology Department of Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Professor Shalin has written extensively about the Soviet Union, including for the op-ed pages of the Christian Science Monitor, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times. Welcome indeed to Monitor Forum.
Thank you.
Dmitri, I talked about Mother Russia in the introduction deliberately. Certainly when I was reading the great novels, one got a sense of the enormous, deep love that Russians have for Russia. As compared with the Soviet Union in its totality, where does that love stand today?
I would correct you perhaps a little bit. I think it is a love and hate relationship, because on the one hand it is a Mother Russia, but on the other hand it's a stepmother that abused its children, and especially intellectuals, so often. So there is this intense feeling that there's no other place like Russia. Intellectually, spiritually, it produced so many values, as you just mentioned, literature, music, and so on.
Incredible richness.
Indeed, but on the other hand, intellectuals have always been a foreign body within Russian Empire, because the Intelligentsia appeared in the 18th century, essentially, and was a creation of Peter the Great, who effectively imported intellectuals from the West and tried to have loyal scholars, historians, poets, and so on. But very soon he discovered that it's impossible to have intellectuals who are loyal to the state and who don't have agenda of their own. And intellectuals emerged as a conscience, morality of the nation, who would speak not only on behalf of the powers that be, but also on behalf of the oppressed people.
So what is it then that you would say is the heart and soul of Russia today? How is that expressed? What do you see it in? Because we're seeing so much nationalism right now.
Mm-hmm. I would say that there is a particular emphasis on ethics and morality that always has been there, which could be carried to a certain extreme of moralism, but is especially now when for the first time Soviet intellectuals have a chance to speak out freely, when they can settle the old accounts for all the conservative politicians and conservative intellectuals. And it turns out, as they examine the past, that they have this sense that they are responsible for the decades of oppression, that even if you were not an oppressor yourself, in some way you contributed to Stalinist and Brezhnev successes. It's interesting to note that liberal intellectuals for a while have been on the attack. They were taking to task others who were notorious scoundrels. But now conservatives counterattack. What they're doing, they're saying that, look, wait a minute, where have you been then? Now you're outspoken, but if you kept silence before Perestroika, why be so sanctimonious today? What conservatives are doing now, they go back and look what liberals used to say in the olden days. And it turns out that Vitaly Karadzic, the famous and flamboyant liberal editor of magazine Ogonyok, once wrote a glowing review of memoirs written by Brezhnev. And now, you know, conservatives point out that, wait a minute, you hardly spoke out your mind then. You were not quite yourself.
Can they carry that over when you have to, or do you have to keep everything that was said in a context of the time?
Well, that's exactly what the debate is all about right now. What did you do at the time? What document you signed? What one you refused to sign? shades are all important in moral affairs. For instance, there was a famous Pasternak trial where hundreds of Soviet writers assembled and effectively expelled Pasternak from the Writers' Union for publishing abroad Dr. Zhivago. And not one of them stood up and spoke in defense of Pasternak. So all of them are responsible, at least tacitly. They are accomplices. They all feel ashamed in some fashion. But on the other hand, certain people at least kept silence in this meeting. Others stood up and spoke against Pasternak, so that already makes a difference. There were people who refused to attend the meeting, calling in sick. And you could say this is not much of a heroic deed, but actually it's a very courageous act at the time. So now what Soviet intellectuals are doing, they're settling all the accounts, going back and seeing how you behaved then. And the assumption is that really until you feel ashamed for yourself, you cannot shame anybody.
How does this relate to the whirlwind of Gorbachev? Here he is instigating so many changes. What's the relationship, is it too early to say, between the intellectuals searching for moral basis or structure and
I think
the
that there is
state?
a direct connection between Gorbachev and the Soviet intelligentsia. For one thing, without Gorbachev there would be no glasnost. Without glasnost, Soviet intellectuals would not be able to speak their mind. And vice versa, without intellectuals, I think Gorbachev wouldn't have been able to accomplish what he did. Because what we witness here is a revolution by discourse, by rhetoric, if you want. It's a revolution in rhetoric, in the fact where public discourse is used to pry open the rigid Soviet society, to introduce new themes. What Gorbachev, of course, discovers that he cannot always control public discourse, that it moves far beyond what he initially examined, and he tries to keep up pace with it. And quite a few intellectuals are not very happy with Gorbachev because they feel that he's too slow, that he's vacillating, that he's trying to be Pope and Luther at the same time, and call him to finally take a stand and declare where he stands on the issue. But there is certain marriage here, maybe not entirely happy one, but both sides need each other.
Yet then you've got right in the middle the body of Russia itself, the populace.
Yes. I must say that what worries me the most is not so much nationalism and ethnic strife on the periphery, much of which is now in the news in Nagorno-Karabakh region, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Lithuania.
All these countries where there's nationalism.
Right. But I think that Gorbachev's biggest headache is Russian nationalism that has been obscured by these developments. Of course, we know that there has been such organization as PAMITS, ultra-nationalist organization with anti-Semitic schemes. But so far, it didn't have much of an influence because intellectuals refused to back it up. But now the situation is changing as more and more intellectuals, Russian intellectuals, are jumping on the bandwagon of PAMIT's platform.
What is, then, Russian nationalism? Can you define it? Because I think, maybe I'm wrong, but we tend to lump the Soviet Union and Russia all in this together. But what we're seeing, these satellite nationalisms coming out so strongly. You mentioned Russian nationalism. Let's just look at that for a moment.
Right. We should realize that the term Russia is somewhat ambiguous because sometimes it refers to a huge conglomerate that includes all sorts of cultures, languages, republics, which have no significant Russian population. Sometimes in a narrow sense, it describes so-called Russian Federated Republic, which includes ethnic Russians proper with some other groups, ethnic groups as well. In still a more narrow sense, the term refers to so-called great Russians, or Velikorossi, who have great pride of national accomplishments, Russian literature, who trace their roots back for centuries, and who feel right now that everybody's speaking on them. There's so many nationalism now in the air, and it looks like Russians are the only group that doesn't have nationalist movement, but that is now changing.
Okay, when we come back, let's just spend a bit more time on the sense of Russian. My first guest is Dmitri Shalin, a visiting scholar at Harvard's Russian Research Center. We'll be back in just a moment. Dmitri Shalin is my first guest on this edition of Monitor Forum, and we've just come to the point of Russian nationalism. Let's just define that a little bit for me.
Okay. I think we can understand the nature of the problem better if we see the sources of the revival of nationalistic feelings among Russians. For a while, it has been a fair game to pick on Russians. Everybody's saying that Russians are servile, that they long for a strong power, that they are lazy, they are incapable of doing things that other people are doing, and that's the source of their problems. And many Russian intellectuals now point out, wait a minute, try to say anything of the kind about Jews, about Armenians, and you will be accused as a racist. They say you cannot have it both ways, take this type of criticisms about Russians and refuse them about other people. So they're saying that we have to reassert our identity as Russians, that we have to see our common purpose and go back to the roots. And there is a lot of soul-searching going on as to what went wrong with Mother Russia. One worrisome implication of this worthwhile pursuit is that there is a sense that a scapegoat is needed to explain everything. And I'm afraid the Jews that historically had been suspected in Russia are again emerging as major scapegoats. You find that some very visible and respected intellectuals, such as Igor Shafarevich, who is a world-famous mathematician and a dissident, just published a long essay called Russophobia, where he says, in effect, that much of our problems could be traced to the fact that Jews have been so prominent during the period of Russian Revolution and after the revolution, that so many leaders in the institutions of oppression like KGB, like NKVD and ЧК, actually had been Jewish. And the argument is that Jews, in some fashion, as he argues, were vengeful, that they were taking revenge on Russian people, and he traces it back to the Talmud, to some Jewish religious things. It's a very anti-Semitic line and a very dangerous line.
I was going to say, that must be very worrisome, because it's history running all over itself again.
I'm afraid so. People don't realize, but over 1 million requests for invitations are now received by Israeli authorities from Russian Jews. From what I know from people back in the Soviet Union, that virtually every Jew now wants, at the very least, to have documents ready so that if hell breaks loose, they would be able to leave. And I wouldn't be surprised if, indeed, the Jewish population in the Soviet Union would dwindle to zero within the next few years.
Now, you mentioned the roots. Let's go a bit back to those roots again, of the basic Russian roots themselves. Very complex. Is there a simple definition?
There's no simple definition. What people don't realize that some of the best-known Russian cultural icons, such as Pushkin, or such as Pasternak, or such as Mandelstam, the poets and writers, actually have some non-Russian blood. For instance, Pushkin has some Ethiopian blood, and he's descendant of some Ethiopians brought by Peter the Great into Russia. Mandelstam is a Jew. Pasternak is a Jew. So the question is, who is a true Russian? According to a sane strand of Russian intelligentsia, which I share, to be a truly Russian, you don't have to trace back for many generations your Russian roots. It's the matter what language you speak, what values you subscribe to. And those liberal intellectuals define the Russianness and the essence of a Russian intellectual as being a moral person who can empathize with the miseries and pains of everybody else. So the argument is that conservative, Slavophile intellectuals who argue exclusiveness and who wants purity of Russian blood among writers, painters, and so on, actually are doing great injustice to the very tradition of Russian intelligentsia.
I love that sense, really, of the tremendous depth of the Russian soul. Yet, as you say, there's that challenge of actually defining it in a moral framework. How do you establish a moral framework which has been so damaged by the immediate past?
I think that there's certain, you can say, dialectical relationship here, precisely because so much of life in the Soviet Union and Russia in general in the past had been so immoral, so corrupt, so coerced, that building up islands of moral constancy, of moral decency, had become a matter of survival for intellectuals. And they would subscribe, in the face of all these inanities, to the very high standards of moral, ethical judgment. Indeed, you could lose all of your friends in no time in Russia if you do anything remotely indecent, suggesting that your moral judgment is not quite on par. So there is this perhaps an exaggerated sense of whether I'm doing the right thing. For instance, when I was leaving the Soviet Union, when I decided that enough is enough.
And that was in 1976.
That was in 1970. I left in 1975 and I came here in 1976. Some of my friends visited me and said, Dmitri, if you are leaving, if we are leaving, who is going to stay? Who is going to fight this all? How can you do it to us? And I must say that until now, I don't have a clear-cut answer whether it was entirely a moral thing to do. If you bear with me, I could bring you one fascinating analogy that I have encountered in Werner Heisenberg. He also lived in Hitler Germany, and many German intellectuals at the time also experienced some of these problems. And after Hitler's fall, there was the Schuldfrage, a question of guilt raised. And Heisenberg brings up a mythical character of William Tell from Schiller's play. You remember that because Tell refused to bow to the heads of the king, he was forced to shoot the apple placed on the top of his son's head. And Heisenberg asked, was he right? Was it a smart and decent thing to do? Why jeopardize the life of your family, the life of your life, when all you have to do is to, step on your ego and bow out? Maybe this is a far more decent thing to do than take chances. This is the essence of the problem. What is a decent compromise? Where decent compromise ceases to be such. Imagine the situation. I sit in the room where all my co-workers are assembled, and my best friend is about to be expelled from the Young Communist League organization, which means he will not defend his dissertation, he will be kicked into the army and whatnot. What do? Do I stand up and say, wake up, people, this is one of the most decent persons I know? Or do I take it easy because I know that I probably will follow him if I say so? What is this borderline that separates a moral, ethical compromise from an ethical one? So Russians revel in these questions. They have such a history, rich history of such moral issues, which again could be pushed to a certain extreme where you could go truly crazy. But that's, I think, specifics of the Russian literature that I think you admire so much, and many other people do.
Dmitri, when we come back, let's just talk a bit about what has really been unleashed here as far as Gorbachev is concerned. My guest is Dmitri Shalin. And we'll be returning in just a moment or two. Dmitri Shalin, a visiting scholar at the Russian Research Center at Harvard University and commentator on Soviet affairs. Dmitri, you're coming into the home stretch here. As a Russian who came here in 1976 to the States, as you look at what's going on, can you assess for me exactly what it is that Gorbachev has unleashed? It just seems to a Westerner so much. And can he keep the pace?
He certainly unleashed something that he cannot control. Some people argue that there's a purpose to it all, to his madness, that it's a controlled chaos, as they say. But I kind of doubt it. I think things are really out of control. Gorbachev is definitely a remarkable politician, and no matter what happens to him tomorrow, I think his place in history is assured. But I would liken him to Moses. I would say that Gorbachev indeed led his people out of captivity, out of Stalinist captivity, but he may not be the one to see the promised land. Indeed, I know several wagers going on in the Russian Research Center at Harvard, where I'm a visiting scholar this year, as to when and how Gorbachev would be removed from power, and military coup is one suggestion. I, for one, wouldn't bet on his being removed just yet. For one thing, Russian history knows no one case of successful military coup for a number of reasons. And even if such coup were to be carried out, I don't quite see how people who carried out would be able to sustain the power, to hold on to power. It's not clear that Russian troops would shoot on the protesters that would be there, for instance. Moreover, I don't see who would like to step in Gorbachev's shoes after the royal mess that he created in the nation. But I would say that there is the second part to this analogy or metaphor that I brought up, which is even perhaps more pertinent. If you remember, when Jewish tribes exited from Egypt, it was 40 years that they were going through wilderness. And the Bible gives you a very good reason why. An entirely new generation had to be born, and the old ways had to die gradually before people could start a new life. And what might sadly be the case is that Russians and all the tribes that now, quote-unquote, inherit this land may need years, if not decades, before a new generation would be born that is not schooled in the old ways, that is thinking differently. And indeed, I think perhaps the most important thing that transpires out of current reforms, out of chaos, is that the seeds of the future, perhaps democratic society, are formed. There are all sorts of national fronts and volunteer organizations, new parties, and the old indoctrination that built up Homo Sovieticus, as some people say, is no longer in place. So if the situation continues for a few more years, we just might be able to say that the changes are irreversible.
Which I would imagine makes the West's relationship with the Soviet Union a difficult one to read.
Most difficult, and there's a good deal of disagreement as to what do we do, if anything, about the situation in the Soviet Union. There was this much discussed article in the New York Times by Z, who says pretty much we shouldn't do anything because the process is out of control. We'll be just helping Gorbachev to perpetuate his system. I don't have a ready-made solution to this debate. I think there are certain things that the West can do which are quite prudent, and I, for one, would move aggressively on the disarmament front. I also think that there's a possibility of helping private entrepreneurs in the Soviet Union. I don't see why the West would lose here. I think I have an article coming up in the New York Times about sex and perestroika, where I argued that the nation is in a horrible shape so far as birth control is concerned. There are no condoms, no diaphragms. And in 1988, every 10th woman in the Soviet Union of childbearing age had an abortion. So I suggest let's help them to get on the feet, and that's one of the areas when we could help. But indeed, in the end, I'm afraid that Russians are on their own, and whether they succeed or fail would largely depend on internal factors.
Dmitri, thank you so much for joining me on Monitor Forum. And when we come back, controversy whirls around the future of Walden Pond. But just how highly do we value Thoreau himself? My next guest, Thomas Blanding, is going to help us become reacquainted with Thoreau, so please stay with us.